Hello. So I'm Dr. Isabelle Amig, the host of UnabridgedMD. And today it's my pleasure to have Dr. Patty George on one of our Coexist meeting. And Patty George has already been on the podcast. I think you were the first. You were the first guest. So thank you again. Now we're season 2. Anyway, so we're going to talk about ketogenic diet. But first, if you don't mind introducing yourself as who are you and why you're so interested in the ketogenic diet?
Yeah, kind of interesting. So first of all, thanks so much for having me back.
Thank you.
Thanks you guys for being here. Really excited to talk to you about it. It's something I'm very passionate about, is people being able to strive and realize their health and live their best lives. That's always been something I've been very passionate about. And let's see. So I am a lung doctor at National Jewish Health. I take care of people who live with a disease called pulmonary hypertension, which we've shared in the past because our patients can overlap.
Yes.
So that's a disease where people feel short of breath. It's high blood pressure in the lungs. And if it's not treated, it can lead towards really severe problems like heart failure. But the whole reason I'm even sitting here in Colorado, much less interested in nutrition, started when I was riding my bike in Deep Creek, Maryland, in a race called the Diabolical Double. So this is long before I was a doctor then. I was a pulmonologist, junior faculty, doing my research and taking care of people. But in my free time, I love to ride my bike, and I ride a lot. And I was getting into ultra racing. We had started a nonprofit. We were gearing up to do Race Across America. So I did this double metric century, and Deep Creek, Maryland is up, down, up, down. There's no flat. And so I don't know if you've heard of bonking. Bonking is where like you do a race and you just become totally nutritionally like deplete. Okay. You feel like you want to die, curl up in a fetal position on the side of the road. Like it was a hot day. I felt horrible. And
is that a choice?
I know, right? So this is like a double metric century. So anyway, I finished the race. And by the way, at the time I was fueling the way people normally fuel. Goos, gels, like the stuff that you get, like a gel every 20 minutes. It says to do that, Gatorade, like whatever sugar, because we're supposed to have sugar because that's what our body needs is carbs. So at the end of this, I then talked to my teammates. We were all preparing for Race Across America. And they had gotten into listening to this podcast called America's Angriest Trainer. And it's this Vinnie Tortorich podcast. You can look him up. He's great. He became this guru in something called NSNG, No Sugar, No Grains. And they're listening. And it's this funny podcast with him, Anna Vocino. I still listen to the podcast. And he was coming out with a book. And at the time, if you're writing a book, and it still is, right? People launch a podcast, etc. And they would talk about the benefits of low carb. And especially low carb with athletes. So all my friends are starting to do this. They're giving up sugars and grains. We didn't call it keto then, but no sugar, no grain. I was like, really? And I was like rice, pasta, cereal. I did the whole thing. So I started doing it. And then I really started geeking out about it. So there's actually some science because, okay, well, if this is working, you're feeling well. So you went from having to eat these gels and goos, which, by the way, if you do an Ironman, I don't do Ironman, I do ultra cycling, and distance cycling. But, at the end of the race, there's oftentimes lots of porta-johns, right? Because people are destroying their gut eating sugar all the time. And so then we started retooling this. And then all of a sudden you can go from needing to eat sugar to going out and doing a ride with water, some nut butters, and some salt tablets. And so it was for hours, 100 miles, 6 hours on the bike, no problem. So then I started, of course, doing some reading, and there's a lot of science by these guys, Jeff Volek, Steve Finney. They've written many papers, but they compiled it into a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. So that's all about athletes. And then they've also written about it, the art and science of low carbohydrate nutrition. So that's more for people with type 2 diabetes. So you start thinking about it, you feel how good. And by the way, I was like at my leanest, and like power to weight ratio, that's like important in cycling. You can climb better if you're lighter and stronger, all this. It was dialed. When we did Race Across America, I was fit. So it worked. And then I started thinking, well, if this works for athletes, like what about people who actually have metabolic problems like type 2 diabetes? So, I see people with pulmonary hypertension, many of whom have, or breathing problems with National Jewish Health. So many of whom have type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, struggle with obesity, along with whatever disease you might have. Yeah. And so, flash forward, when I came here from Pittsburgh, this always was sort of like this question in my head: how can we truly help people improve their health? And so it turns out that there have been studies getting into keto diet a little bit. Okay.
Yes.
So beyond being an athlete.
So I'm just going to hold on here. What is keto diet?
Okay. So a ketogenic diet. So there are different ways that you can eat. And a ketogenic diet is a way of eating at an extreme, like low carbohydrate diet, 30 grams, technically, like 30 grams total carbs or less per day. And then, the rest, it's a high or fat for satiety, not necessarily high fat, but you're allowed to eat fat for satiety, moderate protein. It's not high protein, but moderate protein. Okay. And then a low carbohydrate. And the carbohydrate comes in the forms of like green stuff. And not starchy carbohydrates. So you avoid breads, pasta, rice. You avoid seed oils and like inflammatory oils like that. And you eat things like butter, saturated fat in your diet, meat, and that kind of thing. And a lot of times people fill up with this, with having fat in their diet and eating less calories. But the idea is that it actually can switch one's metabolism to perhaps help you actually mobilize fat stores and put people's metabolism back in check. So you'd have to talk a little bit about what is insulin resistance and that kind of stuff. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, yes. All right. That's a big yes.
So a lot of people suffer from a problem called insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome. So let me take a step back. I'll pretend like we're in clinic and I'm seeing one of my patients that struggles with it. So, when we're talking about people, there are so many health problems that we have medications for. So blood pressure, cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, obesity, sleep apnea, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, some anxiety, perhaps dementia, polycystic ovarian syndrome in females, in premenopausal females, erectile dysfunction in men, like all of these things and more, we have medications for to treat, but not reverse. And at the center of this is this problem called insulin resistance. So normal physiology, this is how I explain it to patients. You eat a standard American diet, may have starchy carbohydrates, etc., and it raises your blood sugar. Your pancreas secretes insulin. Insulin helps bring the blood sugar down and get it out of toxic levels. We're in like this abundant state of having had nutrition. And so we store it in glycogen in our muscles, liver, and there's only so much space. The rest gets stored away as fat. When we keep doing this over time, it's sort of like this pro-energy storage mode, and we have an abundance of energy in our daily lives in the United States, most of us, whether it's cheap calories or just having abundance of food. So what happens over time if this stimulus keeps happening is people can develop like a resistance to it, meaning they need higher and higher levels of insulin to help bring their blood sugars down. It's a lot more complicated than this. Like it involves liver metabolism, et cetera, but this is how I explain it to lay people. When it no longer works and you have high blood sugars, which is long ago, people had high triglycerides, low HDL, like there's all these lipid changes that happen in the liver before you see the high blood sugars. People get pre-diabetes or diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And so that's what happens. So then the question is, okay, so do we just treat this and then their body's making a ton of insulin? So then do we give them more insulin, which by the way is pro-fat storage, or do we shift what led to that state and like liberate them from insulin and other medications? So in pulmonary hypertension, there's multiple types of pulmonary hypertension, but there's a high prevalence of type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes in this state. and we can treat people, and certainly do. Like I'm like you. I treat people with evidence-based medicine.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, how do we approach it?
Yeah.
And we talk about pillars of health, which we can talk about. But when we found, and what we're finding clinically and in our research, is when we actually go at the root cause and try to reverse people's insulin resistance, the side effect is they come off blood pressure medicines. The side effect is they come off insulin or diabetes medications. The side effect is they lose weight. The side effect is some of our patients come off oxygen. The side effect is like they feel empowered because they did it themselves. Yeah. And I'm like, I didn't do this. This was you, right? Yeah. And so like when we actually spend time, which we can do, we can help get these people to a better and more empowered state.
So what I'm hearing is that if you're able, so if we are taking the people who are overweight, obese, that have diabetes, cholesterol, and possibly pulmonary hypertension, I just have a question. What is the difference between, like, what does ketogenic diet does more than just any diet would do by just, getting them to lose weight or exercise? Like, what's the added benefits of ketogenic diet?
Yeah, so like our clinical approach isn't necessarily like at work. It's not necessarily keto for everybody. Mm-hmm. So the whole goal is, at least in our approach, like my approach and my colleagues who do metabolic health there, is to do whatever we can to get people to lower their insulin requirements.
Okay.
So especially if they're giving themselves insulin for type 2 diabetes. So just to be clear, type 2 diabetes is where your body does make insulin, an abundance of it. Type 1 diabetes, which we're not talking about here, is where people have a pancreas and an autoimmune disease that doesn't make insulin. Mm-hmm. They need to take insulin, like their body doesn't make it. So we're talking about type 2, which is the majority of what we deal with. So there are various ways to do that. So as I spoke with a patient today, if we wanted to do this right now in like 5 days, like, why don't you go on a 5-day? I'm not suggesting it, but I'm like, you could go on a 5-day fast. Just drink water, maybe some black coffee, tea, whatever, broth. Just fast. You will drop your insulin levels quickly. You'll go into like this state where you need to mobilize your own energy stores, and that will bring someone's insulin. Jason Fung has written a lot about intermittent fasting. For other people, if they want to do something quickly, they'll go ketogenic. So it's another way of lowering pretty rapidly to going into such a low carb state that it allows the insulin levels to come down and allows you to mobilize fat stores. So insulin's like this fat storage hormone. There's papers that have been published that show when the insulin levels come down, it gets to a certain level, and that allows you to mobilize fat stores. But there's some people we see that like drink soda or juice or, have cereal every morning, and they may not have to go full blown keto. They may actually get those benefits by going lower carb.
Okay.
And it just sort of depends on what a person wants to do, how quickly they want to feel results. Some people start dabbling and then find they feel good and they like kind of get there on their own. So it sort of depends. It's a very personalized approach. Like I don't say, oh, everyone should be keto. It's just sort of what is the person's goal and how can we get you there? And so some people, and also like what seems like something feasible for you. So we've had a couple people that embrace intermittent fasting. We've had others that embrace keto and others that do both. So it sort of depends on what people want to do.
Yeah. So when I'm thinking keto, and I did try, I was very excited to try, but it's hard if you're vegetarian, right? So if you're whole food plant-based, it's actually quite hard because a lot of the food that you can eat is, bacon. I mean, that's like what makes you happy, right? Oh, no, maybe not.
Well, we can talk. Well, yeah, well, it is harder. But there are people who do plant-based keto.
I know.
We're doing a support group on it in March. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And so I could talk about that. But there's different parameters, but it is possible. Yep. But it is harder. It's more complicated.
Yeah, because I mean, like, I could see how an American, like the American diet being a lot of protein already to begin with, like eggs, when they were not at like $8 per 6 eggs,
right?
And then bacon, and then a lot of meat. So I get that. What I wonder is what is it that really does this? Like, is it just that we are eating too much, and so we just need to kind of like stop our process and just like almost like a cleanse or something like this? Or what's the data behind the ketogenic that says like, no, really that does, because you've looked at that does change and you can reverse insulin resistance.
So there have been multiple papers published by, and the first paper was published, first author is Sarah Hallberg. She published a study with Virta Health. And what they did was they took patients with type 2 diabetes. And we can talk about Virta Health in a second, but they took people with type 2 diabetes and they randomized them to standard of care, like managing the diabetes, like so carb count, whatever, how they normally do it. You make sure you take your medications, steady carb, what have you. And then they put people on a ketogenic diet. And they did it with coaching. So it was like this model where you have someone teaching you and coaching you. And what they found when they compared these two groups of people with type 2 diabetes, so this is like the most, like these are truly insulin resistant, not even like borderline. This is like you're there. And what they found was the people with type 2 diabetes, so the people who were in the control group, usual care, their A1C, so hemoglobin A1C is a measure of like your 3-month average glycemic control.
So diabetes.
And so you want it to be less than, so if it's 5.7 to 6.4, that's pre-diabetes. If it's 6.4% higher, that's 6.5 and higher, that's type 2 diabetes. So you want it as low as you have. And so anyway, these people went from a diabetic A1C and it went up over time with usual care model.
Okay.
The people who were on the ketogenic diet, their hemoglobin A1C went down pretty rapidly with like in the first 3 months and then was sustained at a year. And they came off medications like insulin and especially like obesogenic, diabetogenic, like glipizide. These drugs are sulfonylurea, they're horrible for diabetes. They control the blood sugar, but they make the underlying problem worse. And they lost weight. So the average weight loss, when you look at studies, American Heart Association, people get excited in clinical trials about a 5% weight loss. And theirs was a 12% sustained weight loss at a year. Their ASCVD risk score, so the risk of developing cardiovascular disease, decreased. So their lipids got better, even though they're eating saturated fat. Fatty liver disease in another paper has been shown to like regress when you're like switching somebody to a more metabolically healthy state. They came off, blood pressure medications, things like that got better. And so, so with that, when you actually see what happens, it seems like a pretty compelling case to actually shift. It's not just about like, if I just said, which a lot of people, okay, just cut your calories by 200 calories a day, and that's going to equal this many calories. You'll drop a pound every 2 weeks. If your insulin levels are high in a fat, like a pro-fat storage mode, how is that possible? Like, it's just not really possible if you're eating starchy stuff. So if you really want to move that needle, it's about lowering that insulin level. And if you really want to, like, so weight is one side of it. That just sort of, when you actually, like in our clinic, people are always thinking in the back of their mind themselves about weight, but we're talking about, let's get your metabolism healthier. That will come as a side effect with all the rest of it.
A good side.
Yeah.
A good side effect.
Usually, yeah.
Do you think, so, as a scientist, I guess I'm a scientifically trained person. I always think, okay, is it when you're talking about this study that's looking at the people who are decreasing their weight and like doing this diet, ketogenic diet, do you think that we were just maybe looking at the people who were able to go on a diet? Like, for example, I was able to do 3 days because I thought it was really hard. Do you think that maybe it was some sort of confounding of finding the people who were able to actually sustain this diet? Or do you think that it actually, like, is there any study that are looking at 2 types of diet, for example, and shows? I'm sure there is.
Well, no matter what, so that's a big question. And a lot of people, so we presented our work in grand rounds, and one of the little side like questions was, well, everyone knows nutritional studies don't work. One of my comments. Well, it turns out, like, if I put people on medications for pulmonary arterial hypertension, like 40% of the time, they're going to discontinue the medication.
Yeah, 40%.
They have side effects.
Yeah.
Like, this is data. There's been varying things published, but like industry has these kind of things. Like discontinuation rates, chemotherapy for people with cancer, like it's very hard to tolerate. We still offer chemo.
Yes.
Right?
Totally.
Even though it has side effects. So when you talk about nutritional interventions, but yeah, we say, oh, we shouldn't even offer this. There's no way it would work. Okay. So then the question becomes, well, who do we offer it to? So definitely people have to be at a point where they're motivated and want to make change, or like you have to spend that. Like, do you want to, like in some people, come off oxygen? Yeah. Like, it's possible. Do you want to be able to live in the mountains? Like, if they have that motivator, for our people, and certainly in this study, they wanted to be a part of the study.
Yeah. So I guess it's not so much the question of this, because I'm sure, like, of course we should offer it, and I definitely offer it, especially if someone likes meat and all this. I think that ketogenic diet is awesome. No, it's really like, do you think that it's just like any diet that would have decreased their weight would have had the same effect, or do you actually think, and I'm sure you do, because I know you, you looked at the studies, like, why ketogenic diet over Mediterranean diet, or the DASH diet and so on?
Sure.
That's more of a question, is like, should we just tell patients, hey, look at all of the diet and take the one that works the best for you? Ultimately, at the end of the day, we just want you to lose weight. Or do we actually say, hey, you know what? People who have insulin resistance really would benefit from the ketogenic diet.
Yeah. More. So I mean, you have to think about where we're starting from. So again, I don't really, and in our clinic, we don't try to just make everybody keto. We're not a keto clinic. If you want to be, it's a great place. We can certainly coach people through it and make sure people don't get side effects. But when you start with like people who literally know nothing about nutrition, or I shouldn't say know nothing, but know what we've been taught, like, oh wow, American Heart, I should eat my Cheerios, my Honey Nut Cheerios. These are healthy, right? Like Lucky Charms. Oh, this is good. Totally. Like this is what we've been taught, right? Oh, this is high fiber, right? Like, so this is what we're starting with, is like, we should be eating, carbs, not fat. Like, so we try to start, it's all about, okay, well, number one, let's start back with like, how do our grandparents eat? So eat real food. So packaged, processed, boom. So eat real food, like preferably stuff that you can prepare. And it doesn't have to be expensive. Like I can cook a dinner in 10 minutes and it won't be as fancy as what we had tonight, but it gets you by, and it's like, skillet meal and you're done, and it tastes okay. Eat real food, and then avoiding like processed carbs and sugars. And if you were to talk to like my plant-based colleagues, which we have, and I love him very much. We share these philosophies, right? Avoid eating crap, avoid processed carbs and sugars and starchy carbs. There's a bit of a different philosophy around saturated fat and around the, whole grains. But I think people can can shift the needle significantly in that regard. And maybe someone starts with that. So, and then, I guess then after that, it depends on how do people respond. So, you start people on medical therapy and you see how they respond. And then you try to make an okay, do we need to tweak this and alter this? And so I think the same thing happens with nutrition. I think the same thing, it's funny, right? Like we're doctors and we make a diagnosis and here's your medications. And then we're like, oh, by the way, eat less and exercise more, but we don't give them guidance. And then we don't follow up. Well, what did you do and how did it make you feel? And like the same thing goes with exercise. We're like, okay, just exercise more. But like, if you actually, people want structure and they want answers, right? And so when I think a lot of the secret sauce is actually engaging with people on this and then following up. Well, how is it working for you? And how can we tweak it? And so, is it maybe for someone that is Mediterranean diet, because before that they were on the standard American diet. That was a huge shift. And there aren't enough head-to-head studies to say, oh, this should be the diet for everybody. Like both my plant-based colleague and I, like, we don't want to get into diet wars. And so I think that's a large part of it, of how we approach nutrition.
Yeah, thank you. No, that this is very helpful. So in closing, could you share, because I know you have many, could you share a story of hope on someone who has done ketogenic diet? I know you have many, so.
Yeah. My goodness, we do have a lot. And it's the best part. So every story, what it shares in common are people who have tried, right? Like people have tried to regain their health through diet or nutritional interventions. Like I really do hate using the word diet. There's a lot of social words around it. I try to just talk about shifting nutrition, and some people see through it and they're like, oh, you want me, but it's not about depriving oneself anyway. But when people shift their nutrition in some subtle, very slight ways, sometimes there's a huge success. I'll give you an example. So we had a guy come to us. He's a guy who has type 1 diabetes. And he's treated at a clinic. And over time, he had really high blood sugars. And so he's on insulin. So he is the kind where he needs to be given insulin. And it was early diabetes. Anyway, so they put him on an insulin pump, and he has a continuous glucose monitor, the whole thing. And then he's put on other medications. And it's all about trying to control his blood sugar. And then he ends up seeing me, like when I see him in clinic, I learned that he had a cardiac bypass at the age of 35.
Oh, wow, that's young.
And he had stents after that. And he like has diabetic neuropathy, and he can't breathe. And in fact, in my clinic, he's sitting there and like falling asleep in his chair with swollen legs with heart failure. And I don't think it was me personally.
How old was he?
He's like in his late 30s, 38 maybe. Like this is a few years later. And he also gets this pericarditis pain. So we admitted him. We're like, okay, he has so when people hold on to carbon dioxide, they can get what's called hypercapnic respiratory failure. So he's sleepy, he's in heart failure. So we admit him to the hospital. And one of my colleagues, Mike Moaning's on. And so he's into intermittent fasting. Yeah. And so we were like, let's do this. So we put him in the step down unit, and we have him, and the guy himself, he wants to fast. Like for him, he's like, I can do this. I'm so tired of feeling this way, but the only way I can do this is if I go on a fast.
Okay,
perfect. We can monitor your blood sugars. We'll make sure, we'll hook you up. Okay. So we put him on an insulin drip because we didn't know as much then, and we take him off his pump because like, what if something happens, we can't control it. So we do this, we're monitoring him regularly. He was on 400 units a day of insulin. Whoa. By the way, I forgot that part. So 300, and then with correction, 400 units. Like it's just
that's a lot.
More diabetes, more like, so he had type 1 and then insulin resistance type 2. He's obese, the whole thing. So he's just fueling. So he goes from that down to 24 units. Like that's like without.
How long?
Well, we did a 48-hour fast. And then
in 48 hours,
he dropped his insulin requirements to 4 units an hour, and they had been huge. And then it was even lower than 4 units an hour, because that wouldn't be 40 units, I think, a day or something like that. Anyway, I'm struggling with the math.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's okay.
But
a
huge, like
a
a huge chunk. And the reason he stopped, like we were fine. By the way, it's a culture shift when you're putting somebody on an insulin drip who doesn't have diabetic ketoacidosis, like in this scenario. And the nurses are like, oh my gosh. And nutrition's like, you're going to kill this guy and all this stuff. And then finally his primary diabetes doctor calls him.
Yeah.
And by the way, now he's awake. He's feeling good.
Yeah.
Doing his water thing, maybe some diet ginger ale. And he calls him and he's like, you're going to go into diabetic ketoacidosis. And like DKA, which can be a fatal thing, right? In type 1. And he goes, but he's on an insulin drip. He's like, but I'm on the treatment for DKA. And then he's like, but you need to stop. He's like, but why? He's like, well, you just do it for me. So the endocrinologist is like, just do it for me. Like there was no date. So finally, I'm like, we didn't want to. So we took him off, but he's like, I'm going to keep doing this. So he decided he would do a fasting regimen called 1 meal a day, OMAD. And then that meal is very protein and fat and less starchy carbohydrates. So he went, and like his A1C in 2 months goes from like 8 down to 6. Like he's on like low, he has a CGM, like this guy's totally techie, a continuous glucose monitor. So he's fine. Like I get alerts if he gets low because we sent it to my phone too. And he was doing fine. And he like drops, I don't know, 60 pounds. And some of it's fluid, some of it's adipose tissue.
So cool.
His neuropathy gets better so he can play the guitar again.
That's cool.
And like he like feels so, he's off oxygen. Like he just feels better. So that's one example. There's so many more without he's like an extreme. He's one of our favorite people, and he did fasting. Other people follow keto.
Yeah.
It's just sort of what people want to do. It's just amazing when people come in and we have to take them off medications. Yeah. And like now, I mean, his endocrinologist is pretty happy with how he's doing, right? Like we're all on the same page. He doesn't get the chest pain anymore. Like he's a pretty cool guy.
Very cool. Yeah. All right. So I think I'm going to close the interview and then we're going to have a question after. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care and then stop. Thank you.